I received a full riding academic scholarship to my state university last year, which covers tuition, books, and housing in addition to providing a stipend for living expenses. My maternal grandfather was a professor at this university for 40 years, and he established this scholarship fund before he passed away when I was 15 years old. However, my parents demanded $5,000 for their vow renewal, and they even called the university posing as me to get my money. My father worked in construction and frequently took jobs that required him to be away from home for weeks at a time. My mother worked as a receptionist at a doctor's office, but was laid off when I was 11 years old, and she never found another job after that. Ever since then, whenever my father returned home, they would quarrel about money, and my mother would complain that we barely had enough to live on. They got divorced when I was 15 and separated when I was 14, shortly after my grandfather passed away. During my freshman year of high school, I started staying late for study groups and club meetings, which meant I wouldn't get home until after dinner. My mother would occasionally leave a plate of food in the microwave for me, but other times there would be nothing in the months before they separated. My father would respond by saying he was working 60-hour weeks just to keep our roof over our heads. I would then go to my room and put on headphones whenever they started raising their voices. The divorce proceedings lasted for months, during which time my father's construction work had begun to fail and my mother had no income of her own. They fought over the house, the car, and the meager savings they had managed to accumulate. One night, I came home to find my father throwing clothes into a duffel bag. He walked past me without saying anything and didn't come back for a week. When he did return, it was to get more of his belongings. When the divorce was finalized, my mother kept the house but had to find a job to pay the mortgage. She found a job. During this time, I spent most weekends with my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived about 20 minutes away. She would pick me up on Friday afternoons and drop me off on Sunday evenings. Occasionally, I would find my mother sitting in the same spot on the couch when I returned, and other times she wouldn't be home at all. My father was ordered to pay child support, but his work continued to be difficult, and the payments were frequently late or non-existent. My grandmother suggested that I move in with her, but my mother refused, saying that it looked better if her son lived with her. As a result, I continued to live in my childhood home, even though I spent as much time as possible at school or my mother had been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store and appeared less stressed about money, so they started talking again when my father dropped off the child support checks instead of mailing them. By the time I was 17, my father's construction work had somewhat recovered, and he was more consistent with child support payments. Last year, I graduated from high school and learned that I was eligible for my grandfather's scholarship, which would pay for all of my tuition costs for 4 years, provided I kept my GPA at 3. I was going to major in engineering, the same subject my grandfather had taught, and I would be able to devote all of my attention to my studies with a 5 GPA and a small monthly living stipend. The weekend after I graduated from high school, my parents invited me to dinner, which I took to be a celebration of my graduation and scholarship. They were holding hands at a table when I got to the restaurant, and they announced that they had been dating again for 6 months and had decided to renew their vows. The ceremony would take place over the winter break of my freshman year of college. I congratulated them and inquired about their plans, at which point they said they wanted me to help cover the cost of the ceremony and reception, specifically using some of my scholarship stipends. I told them that the stipend was for my living expenses while at university, and my father replied that I would be living in the dorms with a meal plan, so my expenses would be covered. They explained that since my education was already covered, I didn't need the living stipend. They had already chosen a venue and a caterer, and the total cost would be around $15,000. They wanted me to contribute $5,000 for my stipend over the next semester. It would be minimal. My mother added that they had helped me for 18 years, and this was my opportunity to repay them. I pointed out that my grandfather had created the scholarship especially for my education, and that using it for anything else would be disrespecting his wishes. My father waved his hand dismissively, saying that my grandfather wouldn't mind if a small portion went toward a family celebration. When I persisted in refusing, my mother's eyes narrowed, and she said I had left the restaurant and walked the 2 miles back to my grandmother's house, where I had been staying since graduation. When I told her what had happened, she shook her head, not surprised, and said I was welcome to stay with her until it was time to go to college. My father added that I had become selfish since getting the scholarship, and that I thought I was better than them now that I was going to college. They had sacrificed everything for me, and now I couldn't even help them celebrate their reunion. My father texted me to say I owed them this much after everything they had done for me. A week later, my maternal uncle invited the whole family to a barbecue at his house. I didn't want to go knowing my parents would be there, but my grandmother persuaded me it would be better to face them in public. The following day, both of my parents called and texted several times, but I didn't answer. My mother left a voicemail saying I was being childish and that we needed to talk about this as adults. I chose to stay close to my grandmother and engage in small talk with my cousins during dinner. As everyone sat around the large picnic tables in my uncle's backyard, my mother cleared her throat and declared that she and my father had scheduled a date. At first, everything seemed normal at the barbecue. My uncle was grilling hamburgers, my cousins were playing volleyball in the yard, and my mother was talking to her sister. Everyone applauded and congratulated them on their vow renewal ceremony. But she pointedly pointed out to me that they were having financial difficulties because someone who had just become wealthy refused to assist his parents in celebrating their love. The table went silent, and my grandmother placed her hand on my arm, but I pushed it away and got to my feet, explaining to everyone that my mother was referring to the scholarship money that was meant for my education and living expenses while I was a university student. When my mother confirmed that they were discussing the scholarship fund that his father had set up, my uncle's face flushed. He told them it was improper to ask me to use that money for anything apart from what my grandfather had intended. My mother countered that family should help family, and that since my grandfather had always been close to my uncle, he was saying that it wasn't the entire scholarship, but just a portion of the money that I didn't need. My grandmother then reminded them that they had hardly acknowledged my existence during their divorce and the years that followed. She pointed out that neither of them had contributed a single penny to my college fund, while my grandfather had worked hard to establish the scholarship specifically for his grandchildren's education. My father added that they weren't asking for much, just a small contribution to their special day. My mother shouted that I was ungrateful and would regret this decision as my parents stormed out of the barbecue after an argument that escalated with my grandmother and uncle accusing me of turning against them. The following week, I received a message from my father saying that I shouldn't bother attending the vow renewal ceremony if I didn't change my mind. He also mentioned that they had been planning to offer me my old room during the argument. I replied that I would be staying with my grandmother during the summer breaks from college, and I wished them well with their ceremony. I also reaffirmed that my decision regarding the scholarship money was final. 2 days later, I received a lengthy text message from my mother, in which she stated that she had sacrificed her youth and career goals to raise me and my father had worked herself to the bone to support us. The least I could do was assist in making sure that I didn't reply to her message, instead concentrating on getting ready for my move to university. My grandmother helped me buy supplies for my dorm room and promised to drive me to campus. On moving day, the night before I was scheduled to leave for university, my parents unexpectedly showed up at my grandmother's house. My father insisted on speaking with me alone, but my grandmother wouldn't leave the room. My father said that $5,000 wasn't much in comparison to the scholarship's total value, which would cover over $80,000 in tuition and expenses over 4 years. I reminded them that the scholarship was for my education and that I wouldn't disrespect my grandfather's memory by using it for something else. They started crying and said they just wanted one perfect day to make up for all the mistakes they had made in the past. My father also called me selfish and stubborn, just like the following day. My grandmother drove me to university. As we unpacked my belongings in my dorm room, she reassured me that I had made the right choice and that my grandfather would be proud of me for sticking to my principles and honoring his wishes for the scholarship. During my first semester, I received sporadic texts from my mother, who said that I wasn't concerned about their happiness when I still wouldn't budge. My father slammed the door behind them, primarily providing updates on the vow renewal plan. She never brought up the scholarship money again directly, but occasionally made remarks about how they had to scale back their plans because of unforeseen financial constraints. I avoided responding to these remarks and kept my responses brief. My father hardly ever got in touch with me outside of asking when I would be returning home for Thanksgiving. When I told him I would be spending a holiday with my grandmother, he responded with a single word-for-word AITA for not using my scholarship funds to cover my parents' vow renewal update one. It has been roughly 5 months since my last post, and I recently completed my first semester at university, earning a 3.8 GPA and making the dean's list. My engineering classes were demanding but fascinating. I've joined a robotics club that participates in regional competitions, and last month, my parents held their vow renewal ceremony, albeit on a lower scale than they had previously. They rented a small event space at a local hotel instead of the country club venue they had originally wanted, and the catering looked more like a buffet than the plated dinner service they had described to me. About 30 people attended, mostly coworkers from my mother's grocery store and a few of my father's construction friends. None of my grandparents or any of my aunts or uncles from either side of the family were present. I know this because they shared dozens of photos on social media. When I arrived at my grandmother's house for winter break, she showed me the pictures of the family and said that my mother had sent her an invitation at the last minute. but she chose not to go out of respect for me. I told her that I wouldn't mind if she had gone, but she insisted that it was her decision. 3 days into my winter break, my parents returned with a small Christmas present for me, a watch that looked pricey when I opened it. As they were leaving, my mother hugged me and whispered that they had put down a deposit on a rental property as an investment, but were having trouble making the first mortgage payment. My father pointed out that it was the same brand as the one my grandfather used to wear, and my mother added that they had saved up for months to afford it, even with the additional costs of the vow renewal ceremony. They stayed for about an hour, making awkward small talk about my classes and their jobs. My father's face flushed, and he began to speak, but my mother put her hand on his arm and shook her head, and they left without saying anything more. Later that night, my grandmother told me that she had received multiple calls from my parents over the previous few weeks, asking for money for my scholarship. I had previously told them that any assistance I could offer would only be a loan until the property started earning rental income. She repeatedly refused my request to share some of my scholarship money with them, stating that it was for my education only. She apologized for not informing me sooner, but she would rather not ruin my winter break. I was relieved to return to university for my second semester, finding that being away from my parents allowed me to concentrate better on my studies. I also took a part-time job, working 10 hours a week, to supplement my income that wasn't related to my scholarship. Except for a happy birthday text on my 19th birthday in February, when I thanked him, my father hardly ever contacted me. I replied politely but briefly to the occasional text my mother sent, which were usually pictures of her and my father doing ordinary things like eating out or watching TV together. She never mentioned money directly but occasionally included remarks about how they were making sacrifices or cutting back to make ends meet. My previous update was 6 months ago, and I finished my freshman year with a 3. I decided not to go back to my hometown for the summer and instead rent a small apartment close to campus with a classmate who also has a summer internship in the area. My grandmother and I have an engineering internship for the summer at a firm in the same city as my university. The internship is paid, so I've been able to save some money beyond my scholarship stipend. Was understanding and has already paid me 2 visits. My parents' behavior changed after months of hardly speaking to me. They started texting and calling frequently when they found out I wouldn't be returning home for the summer. My mother said they had been arranging a family vacation to make up for all the stress from the previous year, and my father said they had been renovating my old room in anticipation of my staying there. I clarified that I had already signed. They both denied ever saying this last month when they showed up at my apartment and somehow persuaded a close friend to give them my address. My roommate allowed them in before I got back from my internship, but my father accused me of purposefully avoiding them, and my mother suggested I was being influenced by my grandmother, who had always disliked her. I reminded them that they had previously told me I wasn't welcome in their home unless I contributed financially. My mother had brought a home-cooked meal in plastic containers, and my father was inspecting our apartment and making remarks about things that needed repair. They stayed for 3 hours, during which they repeatedly mentioned how expensive their new rental property was turning out to be. The tenants had damaged some appliances, and they had to replace the water heater. When I arrived for my internship, they were sitting in our living room looking through my textbooks. My father took out his phone and showed me before departing. My mother gave me a tight hug and slipped a piece of paper into my hand that contained a bank account number and a note saying anything you can spare would help. I gave the paper back to her and reiterated that my scholarship money was for my education. But my father shook his head and muttered something about me becoming the owner of the property. He showed me pictures of the property and highlighted all the work he had done himself to save money. My roommate asked me if my parents always behaved that way after they left, and when I asked him what he meant, he said that they had been waiting for me the entire time discussing their financial issues and asking if he knew how much my scholarship stipend was. 2 weeks later, I received an email from the University Financial Aid Office asking them about the payment schedule for my scholarship stipend. Claiming to be me when I suspected my parents right away, so I called my grandmother to see if she had heard from them recently. She informed me that they had visited her the weekend before, asking in-depth questions about my grandfather's scholarship fund, but the caller was unable to provide the right answers and hung up. The financial aid officer wanted to make sure I hadn't made this call and to remind me never to share my student ID or financial information with anyone. After talking to my grandmother, I decided to meet with the financial aid office in person. I explained the situation and asked what safeguards were in place for my scholarship fund. The counselor reassured me that all disbursements went directly to my student account for tuition and other expenses. She had shown them the door and called me as soon as they left, but I had been busy and missed her call. Housing, with just the living stipend going into my personal bank account. They added additional security questions to my account and stated that no changes should be made until I physically show my ID. I also went to my bank and opened a new account at a different institution, transferring my savings and setting up the deposit of my stipend and internship payments there. I didn't tell my parents about this, and 2 days later, my mother called, sounding agitated, claiming when I offered sympathy, but again refused to pay for my scholarship. She broke down and admitted that they had called the financial aid office posing as me. She justified it by saying they were desperate and knew I wouldn't help voluntarily. She insisted they would repay every penny once the rental property started making money. Her father had been hurt at work and needed surgery that their insurance wouldn't fully cover. They needed $7,000 and had nowhere else to turn. She started crying and handed the phone to my father, who chastised me for threatening my parents and lacking any sense of family loyalty. After that call, I blocked their numbers and email addresses and spoke with a university counselor. I also told her that what they had done was fraud and could have jeopardized my entire scholarship. I also told her that I had already taken steps to secure my accounts and that any further attempts to access my scholarship money would force me to take legal action. I'm continuing my internship and concentrating on my academics thanks to the Student Services Office, which assisted me in creating a strategy for moving forward without contact with my parents. My grandma also keeps in touch with me regularly and even speaks with my grandfather's old coworkers to guarantee my scholarship status is safe regardless of my parents' behavior.